Hello everybody, Justin from Playing Board Games here, and today I have 5 spoiler-free tips for you for the Feast of Hemlock Vale. If you don't know, I've been going through and almost have finished up doing this for all of the campaigns with hopeful guidance to give you where to start your deck building, where to build your focus, what to expect, without getting any hard spoilers for the campaign. There's a link to all the previous ones below. This is Hemlock Vale. Drowned City should be coming out in the near future, but I think we just dive in and talk about all these tips. And again, I'll try to be as spoiler-free as possible. Some of them might be a little bit less spoiler-free than others, but ultimately I'm going to try to keep this as spoiler-free as we go. Alright, first one we have here. Incidental damage goes farther in Hemlock Vale. So this one's a little bit loaded because I kind of have to explain what incidental damage is. Incidental damage is damage that is not like the main source of damage in your deck. So an example of this is the machete that you're fighting with is your main source of damage in your deck, and an upgraded beat cop is incidental damage on top of that. This is most commonly seen in effects where there's a 3 health enemy. You will use the machete to attack, and then you will use beat cop to finish the enemy off with the 1 point of damage that the upgraded beat cop can give. This incidental damage, that 1 point of damage, is very good in the Feast of Hemlock Vale, and it's going to ask for this multiple times. Because of this, if your main source of damage, if you're only relying on one thing, so this will affect mostly mystics who use spells, and then guardians and rogues that are using firearms. You're going to have a slightly harder time in the Feast of Hemlock Vale. It's not going to be impossible, but there is a mechanic that's going to be a recurring thing through the Feast of Hemlock Vale, where this is going to be a little bit more punishing than some of the other campaigns. Each campaign kind of brings its own little plot twists and mechanical hurdles for you to overcome, and this is one of the big ones here in the Feast of Hemlock Vale. So, you're going to want to find damage that you can do in addition to your main damage, or can kind of just happen. Something that's just like a little poke of damage at the right time, or multiple pokes of damage from one effect. An example of this is like the butterfly swords. This is where you're going to be doing 2 attacks, like 2 1 damage attacks can sometimes go farther in the Feast of Hemlock Vale than 1 2 damage attack, which is kind of funny, but it is one of those weird things that the Feast of Hemlock Vale has as one of its main mechanics, and it is going to be something that is going to challenge you. So find incidental damage, use it where you can, and you will find more success. My next spoiler-free tip here is you will be rewarded for over-succeeding on tests. This is something that is nice to have in your back pocket for when the time comes. Going back to butterfly swords as an example of a thing that's going to help you over-succeed on tests. If you want to just steamroll through this, honestly, butterfly swords is a pretty good weapon to bring to the Feast of Hemlock Vale, but that's neither here nor there. This is something that's not going to happen all the time. You're not always going to be rewarded for succeeding on tests. But when it is something that comes up, you'll be very grateful that you have it. This is not necessarily something that you need to have all the time or in mass quantity of. So, for example, in the Mystic class, a good Read the Signs or a good Spectral Razor, or in the Rogue class, which like to over-succeed anyway, a Breaking and Entering or other things that can make you succeed really well, or just if you're a Seeker, putting your book up really high, or if you're a guardian, making your fist really high, just loading up your weapon and just make sure you succeed by a big amount. At the right time, you'll know when you want it, and it will feel very good when it does happen. Also, just generally, this is kind of just advice that is just good, right? The more you are successful, and then the worse the bag can hurt you with the less resources that you put into it, the better shot that you're going to have, and the more likely you are to succeed. So it's one of those things that, while this is true in all campaigns, in the Feast of Hemlock Vale, there are certain mechanics that if you want to have some of these in your back pocket, it doesn't need to be the main thing that you do, but if you have the option to do this in ways that are consistent with spending as few resources, whether it be cards or actual resources, as possible, this can go a really long way. Another good thing to have are those the physical training hyper awareness level 4 assets that you can use to bump up your skill value without spending any actual resources. These are things that will add up and will go the distance for making your Feast of Hemlock Vale a little bit of a smoother experience. Alright, next tip we have here is you can be a bit looser with deck consistency. This one is I'm going to have to do some... I'm going to have to be a little bit less spoiler-free here for this one, because this is a very weird statement to make. Generally, you want your deck to be wildly consistent. At least for me, consistency is king, and it's the reason that you'll win a scenario with little stress or no stress, as opposed to winning a scenario with some or a lot of stress. This is most commonly done through, for me, for example, card draw or redundancy. And Feast of Hemlock Vale kind of turns this on its head, mostly due to a mechanic where there are two different types of scenarios in this campaign. There are day scenarios and there are night scenarios. I'm not going to go into what's the difference between those two, apart from this mechanical difference. I'm going to go right here. So again, I'm going to have to do some... This one's going to be less spoiler-free than the other ones, but it's still going to be very spoiler-light. During the day scenarios, you have time to prepare, which means that you can set up, it's easier for you to get set up and ready to go. In the night scenarios, it's like a normal ARKHAM scenario. You don't get that setup time. So this is just something to keep aware of, that half of this campaign, you actually have time to set up your stuff for. So you can be a little bit looser with deck consistency. This doesn't mean that you should sacrifice deck consistency completely. Again, consistency is king. It's the reason why you will win the game easier than if you don't have it. But you don't need to go as hardcore as you usually do, or in my case, as hardcore as I go is usually pretty hardcore to make sure it's working. But it's one of those things that in Feast of Hemlock Vale, I'm a little bit looser with this, and it's something that you can be as well. It also allows you to kind of just like spread a little bit more into one-ofs, which I think is kind of a very thing that people like to do to get a little bit of taste of a lot more of their card pool. And it's one of those things that Feast of Hemlock Vale gives you that space to do. So just something to consider. The next tip we have here is pay attention to what the residents say to you. There is a mechanic in this campaign that's called the Residents, otherwise known as the dating sim mechanic, where, like Edge of the Earth, it's like Edge of the Earth but different. There are a variety of residents of Hemlock Vale that you will get to interact with throughout the course of the campaign. Just like how there's the expedition members in Edge of the Earth that will join you on the journey throughout the entire campaign, right? And kind of get like the story that progresses with them. Feast of Hemlock Vale is very similar in theme to that mechanic, but it does it very different with its mechanical identity. However, there are a lot of people who in their blind play, they mention that this is kind of a mechanic that you fly by the seat of your pants with. You can't really find the consistency to link up to where people are when you need to be, and it's a little bit random. Or so they say. However, if you actually just really focus on what the residents say to you when you do talk to them, you will find the line to follow to make sure that you can complete their story, or at least know where to look for where they might be at certain points throughout the campaign. They kind of because the island, imagine the whole campaign takes place on one island, and they kind of move around the island as the story progresses. And if you want to have, for example, a favorite resident that you want to pursue, that resident will give you hints of where they're going to be. So just pay attention to what they say and when they say, and don't be afraid to take notes. There's sections in your campaign guide to do it, or just even scribble it on the back if you print it out. This is something that I definitely can attest to the frustration with it, especially if there's one that you find to be your favorite resident. And again, you want to just make sure that that resident is, you're pursuing their story to completion. Just stick with them, pay attention to what they say. They do give you hints of where they're going to go. Some are admittedly more vague than others, but they're all the breadcrumbs are there and you just need to follow it. However, this doesn't help with interacting with them. You need to make sure you make the right choices, and some of those choices might seem a little bit strange given in the moment, but just know that this is a campaign that's designed to be replayed to both its positives and its negatives. So just something to consider, that you're not going to see every resident's story to completion on your blind play. That's just impossible and not going to happen. Something to consider. And finally, our last spoiler-free tip here is very hyper-focused, but honestly, the first two tips are going to go the longest for the Feast of Hemlock Vale. Those are the things that, whenever I make these spoiler-free videos, I always try to look at what I do for my deck building when it comes in advance, and those two go the long way. So this last one is a little bit smaller in scope. If you are playing with 2 or fewer players, action compression is very important in this campaign. The scenarios ask a lot from you. In 3 or 4 players, this is actually very easy to manage. However, 2 players in Feast of Hemlock Vale, it can get a little bit tight and it can be a little bit tricky. So, if you're going to want to find some sort of consistent action compression, if you're playing with 2 or fewer players, that you can take advantage of. In the final scenario in particular, it had to have a refraction, which is kind of like a taboo for scenarios, to give players more time, because the scope of what was required was very, very tight for that final scenario. So it's just one of those things that you want to just know that you can kind of look up the refraction to play with it, or alternatively, if you want to go in completely blind, just make sure your deck has good action compression. So whether this be saving on movement is always the easiest and most enjoyable form of action compression that people have, but alternatively there is clue compression is a good way, damage compression, and again the incidental damage that I mentioned earlier. So you're just going to make sure that your decks are efficient. Otherwise, you might have a really rough go in later parts of this campaign when it demands more from you. There are some very hard scenarios in this campaign, and they are designed to be difficult. So it's just one of those things to keep in mind. I think that this scenario has a very interesting balance in terms of its difficulty, where some parts of it are very manageable, and then some parts of it are very overwhelming, again, by design. And I think that this is kind of put into action by the day and night mechanic when you see it and you start diving into it. But you can just take advantage of this by these 5 tips here, which is incidental damage, over succeeding. Clue getters don't really get challenged too much in this campaign. It's mostly the fighters who have the unique mechanics thrown on them. However, the making sure that your deck is consistent with its action compression is probably the biggest tip I have if you're playing with 2 or fewer players. You have a bit more space than 3 or 4 players just by the nature of having more players and more actions of the team each round, but it's just something to consider. Feast of Hemlock Vale is my second favorite campaign. I love the scenarios in this campaign. It's a very fun campaign for me to play. There's like no scenario that I outright hate in the campaign. So I hope you enjoy your blind play of it, and I hope that these tips will give you some good guidance of where to start, and then maybe when you're playing it, you'll see something and be like, so that's what Justin meant. That's what he meant by that thing there. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching, everybody. As I mentioned, I'll be doing the Drowned City one coming up in the near future. I've played the Drowned City like 4 or 5 times now, so I have some tips for you. So keep your eyes open for that on the channel, but in the meantime, thanks for watching. Have a good one, and as always, a GG's.